She had exactly 3 days to escape before her father sold her to a man old enough to be her grandfather. Margaret Catherine was 21 years old when she watched her own father shake hands with Vincent Holloway, a wealthy Texas cattleman with yellowed teeth and eyes that crawled over her body like she was livestock at an auction. The wedding was set, the deal was done, and nobody asked her permission. So, in the dead of night, dressed in her dead brother's clothes, she climbed out her bedroom window and rode into the desert alone, with nothing but a few coins, dried beef, and a desperate prayer. What she didn't know was that her father would send armed men to drag her back. What she didn't know was that a stranger would risk his life to hide her. And what she absolutely could not have imagined was that running from one marriage would lead her straight into the arms of a love so powerful it would last over 40 years. But first, she had to survive. This story reminds us that true freedom begins the moment we refuse to let others write our destiny, and that sometimes the greatest love finds us when we're brave enough to run toward the unknown. If you believe every woman deserves to choose her own path, leave a comment below. And if this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe and hit that bell so you never miss another story that celebrates courage, love, and second chances. The dust from the stagecoach hadn't even kissed the ground when Margaret Catherine watched her father shake Vincent Holloway's hand, sealing a deal for her future that she had no part in making. In that single awful moment, she decided she would sooner face the desert sun than marry a man 30 years her elder, who stared at her like a prize heifer at auction. She was just 21 years old, standing in the parlor of their ranch home near Santa Fe, New Mexico territory in the spring of 1878, as her entire world collapsed. "Well, that settles it," her father announced, using that final tone she'd come to despise. "The wedding will be in 2 weeks. That gives us plenty of time to get everything ready." Margaret's fingers dug into the folds of her dress. Vincent Holloway was a rich cattleman from Texas, a widower with children who were older than she was, and his smile, full of yellowed teeth, made her feel sick to her stomach. "I surely look forward to making you my wife, Miss Catherine," he drawled, his gaze crawling over her body and making her want to hide. She started to speak, to scream, but one sharp look from her father stopped the words in her throat. For weeks she had pleaded with him ever since he first brought up the idea, but he was stubborn, insisting this marriage was the only thing that would save their family's finances. Her mother had been gone for 3 years, and with her gentle spirit went all the softness in her father, leaving only a man who cared more for his ledger than his own daughter's heart. That night, Margaret stared at the ceiling, the distant howls of coyotes sounding like a lonely song. She could not do this. She would not. As the first light of dawn painted the sky in shades of rose and orange, her mind was made up. She had to run away. For the next 3 days, Margaret secretly prepared for her journey. She collected small things that no one would miss, stashing them in an old saddlebag she kept under her bed. She packed dried beef, hard biscuits, a full canteen, matches, and the small amount of coins she had saved over the years. She understood the dangers for a woman traveling by herself in this wild country, but the danger of staying was far greater. On the 4th night, with only a sliver of moon in the sky, Margaret pulled on a pair of her late brother's old trousers and a shirt, which she had kept since he passed from a fever 2 years back. She braided her long, dark hair tightly and hid it beneath a worn hat, praying she might be mistaken for a boy from a distance. She placed a short, simple note of apology on her pillow, then climbed out of her bedroom window and crept toward the stables. Her heart was trying to beat its way out of her ribs as she saddled her mare Rosie, a sweet chestnut with a white star right between her eyes. In the dead of night, every rustle of leather sounded like a gunshot. But no lights came on in the house. No one shouted an alarm, and in a matter of minutes she was riding away from the only place she had ever called home. Margaret pointed Rosie north and west, staying far away from the main trails where she could be easily seen. She had heard stories about Mormon towns in the Utah territory, places where a single woman could find honest work and build a new life. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot she had. The land around her slowly changed from gentle hills to jagged country, with flat-topped mesas rising up like giants against the horizon. She had been on the trail for 5 days, making her food and water last, and sleeping in dry creek beds, when she heard the thundering of hooves coming up behind her. A cold dread washed over her. She spurred Rosie on, trying to get more speed, but the poor horse was worn out and the riders were closing the distance. She could now make out their voices shouting her name. It was her father's foreman and 2 other ranch hands he must have sent to drag her home. "Miss Catherine, stop this foolishness. Your father just wants you back." Margaret dug her heels into Rosie's sides, but the mare stumbled on the loose rocks, nearly bucking her off. The men were on her now, so close she could hear the jingle of their spurs and the ragged breaths of their mounts. Just as she came over a rise, she saw a narrow valley below with a small ranch tucked up against a wall of red cliffs. A thin ribbon of smoke curled from the chimney, and she could see a few horses in a corral. It was her only hope. She urged Rosie down the steep embankment, loose stones scattering from under the mare's hooves. From behind her, the foreman yelled, "She's making for that ranch! Head her off!" Margaret hit the valley floor and raced toward the cluster of buildings, her hat tearing from her head and her long braid flying out behind her like a banner. A man stepped out of the barn. He was tall and lean, with dark hair, and a face that had seen its share of sun and wind. He had on a dusty shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, showing strong tanned arms. As he watched her approach, his hand drifted down to rest near the pistol on his hip. "Please," Margaret gasped, pulling Rosie to a dusty halt right in front of him. "You have to help me. They're trying to force me into a marriage I don't want." Even in her fear, she noticed the cowboy's eyes were a startling shade of blue-gray, the color of a stormy sky. He glanced past her at the 3 riders, bearing down on them, then his eyes came back to her own panicked face. A change came over his expression, a tightening in his jaw, as if he had just made up his mind about something important. "Get inside the barn," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. "There's a little storage room in the back, behind the sacks of feed. Go hide in there, and don't you make a peep." Margaret didn't stop to ask questions. She jumped down from her horse and hurried into the barn, pulling a tired Rosie along with her. The inside was cool and dark and smelled of hay, horses, and old leather. She found the storage room just like he said and ducked inside with her mare, pulling some heavy feed sacks across the opening to hide them from view. Through a crack in the wooden wall, she heard the riders pull up, their horses snorting and stomping. "Afternoon," the cowboy said, and Margaret was amazed at how casual he sounded. "Something I can do for you, gentlemen?" "We're looking for a woman," her father's foreman growled. Margaret knew that voice. It was Tom Brewster, a hard man who had worked for her father for more than 10 years. Dark hair, riding a chestnut mare. "We tracked her this way. She's runaway property. Belongs to her father." "A woman is not property," the cowboy said, and now Margaret could hear a sharp edge in his tone, like a hidden blade. "That is not your business," Brewster snapped back. "Her father wants her returned. She has promised to be married and took off like a scared rabbit. Now, where is she?" "I have not seen a soul that fits that description," the cowboy stated plainly. "You're welcome to have a look around, but I'll tell you right now, I don't much like men who run down women and try to call it justice." There was a long, tense silence. Margaret held her breath and put a hand on Rosie's soft nose to keep her from making a sound. "You are lying," one of the other men accused. "We saw her ride straight to this very spot." "Then maybe she kept on riding," the cowboy offered. "This valley cuts through to a pass that heads west. Might be you ought to look there instead of standing on my land throwing around accusations." Margaret heard the thud of boots hitting the dirt as one of the men dismounted. "I think we will just take a look in that barn," Brewster declared. "I think you will get back on your horse and ride on out of here," the cowboy answered, and this time his voice was as hard as stone. "I told you I have not seen your runaway girl. I have been right here all day working my own place. Now you can take my word for it, or you can call me a liar, and we can settle this a different way." The air was so thick with tension you could have cut it with a Bowie knife. Margaret's heart was beating so loud she was sure they could all hear it. Do you have any idea who her father is? Brewster challenged. His name is Richard Catherine. He owns one of the biggest ranches in all of New Mexico territory. He has got money, and he has got power, and he will not take kindly to you getting in the way of him getting his daughter back. I do not know this Richard Catherine, the cowboy said flatly, and frankly, I do not give a damn about his money or his power. This here is Utah territory, and you boys are a long way from home. Now, I have asked you nice to leave. I am not going to ask you again. Then Margaret heard a sound that made her blood run cold. The click of a pistol's hammer being pulled back. Another long, heavy silence followed. Finally, Brewster spoke, his voice strained with fury. This is not finished. If we find out you have been hiding her, you will regret it. I will take my chances, the cowboy replied. The men got back on their horses, and Margaret listened as the sound of their hoofbeats slowly faded away. She stayed hidden, hardly daring to breathe, until she heard footsteps come into the barn. They are gone, the cowboy called out from just outside the storage room. It is safe to come out now. Margaret shoved the heavy feed sacks aside and stepped out, blinking as her eyes adjusted to the light pouring in through the big barn doors. The cowboy was standing there, his pistol back in its holster, just watching her with those remarkable eyes. Thank you, she said, her voice still trembling from the whole ordeal. I cannot imagine what they would have done to me if you had not been here. They would have taken you back, he said with simple certainty. Are you truly on the run from a marriage your father set up? Yes, Margaret answered, looking him straight in the eye. My father arranged it all without ever asking me. The man is old enough to be my grandfather. I cannot marry him. I will not. The cowboy gave a slow nod, seeming to accept her story. My name is August Garrett, he told her. This is my place for what it is. It is a small outfit, just me and a few head of cattle and horses. I am Margaret Catherine, she said, but I suppose you figured that out already, from hearing them out. You need to listen to me, Miss Catherine, August said, his face dead serious. Those fellas might have believed me for now, but they'll be back. You can count on it. They're going to ride to the nearest towns and start asking questions. Once they figure out you ain't on the Western Pass, they'll bring more men and tear this place apart looking for you. A man like your father has the means. Margaret felt the little hope she had drained right out of her. Then I have to go. I never should have brought this trouble to your door. That ain't what I said, August cut in sharply. I said they're coming back. That just means we have to be smarter than them. If you ride out of here by yourself, they'll catch you before the sun sets tomorrow. You've had a bit of luck, but a woman traveling alone in this country runs out of luck real fast. So what am I supposed to do? Margaret asked. August was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. You'll lay low here where no one can see you while I head into town. I'll get the lay of the land and see what's what. If your father's men are poking around, I'll hear about it. Then we can decide our next move from there. Our next move? Margaret echoed. Why are you doing this for me? You don't even know me. This isn't your fight. August held her gaze, his eyes unwavering. My own mother was pushed into a marriage when she was just 16, he said, his voice low. She lived 20 long, hard years with a man who treated her no better than hired help, and often worse. When she finally got away from him, she told me that no woman should ever have to give her life to a man she didn't choose. So yes, Miss Catherine, I'm going to help you. Not because I know you, but because it's the decent thing to do. Margaret felt the sting of tears in her eyes. She hadn't let herself cry once since she'd fled, refusing to show that kind of weakness. But the simple kindness from this stranger was about to break her resolve. Thank you, she managed to whisper. You can use the house, August offered. It ain't fancy, but it beats sleeping in the barn. If you see anyone coming, you get down in the root cellar. The entrance is under the floorboards in the kitchen. Tell me, can you cook? The question was so sudden it almost made Margaret laugh. Yes, I know how to cook. Good. I'm getting mighty tired of my own meals, August said, and the barest trace of a smile touched his lips. Come on inside. You look like you could use some real food and a solid night of rest. The house was small, just as he said. It had 3 rooms in total: a main room that served as the kitchen and living space, a bedroom, and a small storage area. But it was clean and tidy. The furniture was sturdy, looked like he'd made it himself, and the windows let in the warm afternoon sun. August showed her the root cellar, which was a little space you reached by lifting a part of the kitchen floor where potatoes and other goods were kept in the cool dark. "Keep clear of the windows," he warned her. "And make sure your horse stays hidden in the barn. If anyone comes around asking, I'll just say she belongs to a ranch hand who's out checking on the herd." Margaret nodded, absorbing every word. August fixed a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, and they ate without talking much. The strangeness of it all hung in the air between them. Here she was, a lone woman with a man she just met, trusting him with her life. Her father would have said she'd just swapped one danger for another. But there was something about August Garrett's direct way of talking, and the honesty in his eyes that made her feel safer than she had in a very long time. After they ate, August got ready to ride to the closest town, a place called Parowan, about 10 miles to the north. "I ought to be back around dark," he said, cinching his saddlebags. "You remember what I told you. Stay indoors, don't make a sound, and if you hear a horse that ain't mine, you get down in that cellar." "I will," Margaret promised. She watched him from behind the edge of a curtain as he rode off on a tough-looking gelding, making his way north across the valley floor. And then she was all alone in a stranger's home, in a place she'd never been, with men chasing her from behind, and no idea what lay ahead. She should have been frightened out of her wits, but instead, a peculiar quiet settled over her. For the first time since her father had told her she was to be married, she felt like she could finally take a full breath. Margaret passed the afternoon cleaning the small house, just to keep her hands busy and her mind from wandering. She swept the wooden floors, washed their plates, and started a stew with what she could find in the pantry. She used some salt pork, dried beans, and the last of a few root vegetables. It felt right to be working, to be doing something ordinary while her mind was in a turmoil. August Garrett was a puzzle. He had put himself on the line for someone he didn't know, lied to dangerous men for her, and hadn't asked for a single thing. He was younger than she had guessed, maybe 25 or 26, with the wiry, strong body of a man who earned his living with hard labor. But there was a look in his eyes, a kind of sadness or a heavy weight, that made her think he'd seen his own share of trouble. She found herself wondering about his story. What had led him to this quiet valley to run a little ranch all by himself? The sun was going down, painting the whole sky in vivid strokes of orange and purple. When Margaret heard the sound of hoofbeats, she went still, her heart pounding. But then she recognized the gelding. August was home. She was at the door as he swung down from his horse. "They're in Parowan," he said, getting straight to the point. 3 men. They fit the description of your father's ranch hands, and they're asking questions all over town about a woman with dark hair. They're put up at the boarding house and have made it known there's a reward out for any information." Margaret felt her stomach clench. "How much?" $50, August said. "That's a whole lot of money in these parts. It'll get people looking hard." $50. For most folks in the territory, that was more money than they'd see in a year. Margaret collapsed into a chair, feeling the fight go out of her. Then it's just a matter of time before someone sends them this way. August pulled another chair over and sat down facing her. "Not if we're smart about it. I made sure I was seen around town. I spoke to a few people, let on that I was looking to hire a ranch hand. I told them my cousin from Colorado was supposed to come help me out but hadn't arrived yet. If anyone asks, your name is Matthew Curtis. You're my cousin, and you just got here yesterday. We keep your hair tucked up and you wear men's clothes, and you don't go anywhere near town. As far as anyone else is concerned, I've just got a new hand helping me out." Margaret just stared at him. "You want me to pretend I'm a man?" "I want you to stay alive and stay free," August said, his tone blunt. "Those men are looking for a lady on her own. They won't be paying any mind to a ranch hand working beside me. It's not a forever plan, but it'll buy us some time. Time for what? Time to come up with a real one, August answered. Look, I know this is a tough pill to swallow, but you don't have many choices. You can take off on your own and probably be caught in a day or two. You can give up and go back to that man. Or you can trust me, just for a little while, and let me see you through this. Margaret pictured Vincent Halloway, his cold gaze and his damp handshake. She thought about the life she would have as his wife, having his children, managing his home, and feeling a little piece of her soul die each day. Then she looked at August Garrett, this cowboy who had already done so much for her, and she made up her mind. All right, she said. I'll be Matthew Curtis, your cousin from Colorado. What do I have to do? A bit of the tension left August's face, and she saw then that he'd been truly worried she would say no. First thing, we need to make you look less like you, and more like a ranch hand. Your brother's clothes are a good start, but they're too new, too clean. I've got some old work shirts and trousers that'll likely fit you better. We need to make you look like you've been working cattle, not just playing dress-up. For the next hour, August helped Margaret change her appearance. He gave her faded shirts and patched pants, a beat-up old hat, and a pair of gloves worn through at the fingers. He taught her how to wrap her chest to hide her shape, how to walk with a longer step, and how to stand with her weight shifted. He even had her try talking in a deeper voice, keeping her answers short and to the point. The most important thing is to not talk to anybody if you can help it, he told her. Keep your head down. I'll do the talking. If someone asks you something directly, just grunt or give a nod. Most folks won't look twice at a ranch hand. They ate the stew Margaret had made. August said it was the best thing he had eaten in months, and she could tell he meant it. They began to talk, slowly sharing pieces of their past. August told her he grew up in Kansas. His father died when he was a boy, and his mother married a hard man. He left home when he was 16 and drifted west, taking jobs on different ranches until he'd saved enough to buy this plot of land 2 years ago. It ain't much, he said, glancing around the simple house, but it's all mine. Nobody to tell me what to do. Nobody to take what I've earned. That kind of freedom is worth more than a big ranch where you're always under some boss's thumb. Margaret told him about her life back in New Mexico, about her mother passing away and how her father became obsessed with money and his standing in society. She told him about Vincent Halloway, the way he would look at her, and the thoughtless cruelty she'd seen in how he treated his staff and his animals. He would have made my life a living misery, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I know my father thinks I'm being selfish, that I should just make this sacrifice for the family's sake. But I can't do it. I can't just throw away my entire life for one of his business deals. You shouldn't have to, August said with conviction. Marriage ought to be a choice, not some kind of trade. They sat quietly together for a time, with the fire crackling in the hearth. Margaret found herself looking at August's profile in the firelight, the strong set of his jaw, and the way his calloused hands rested calmly on his knees. He was not a handsome man in the traditional sense, but he was rugged, and there was a kindness in his eyes that did not quite match his tough exterior. For the first time in a long while, she felt truly safe with him, a feeling she thought she had lost for good. You ought to take the bedroom, August said, pulling her from her thoughts. I will sleep out here by the fire. That is not right, Margaret protested. This is your home. I can take the fire. You have been sleeping on the hard ground for 5 days, August told her. You need a proper bed. I will not hear another word on it. Margaret was too bone-tired to argue anymore. She gave him a grateful thank you and went to the small bedroom where a simple bed with a quilt was waiting. She laid down in all her clothes, ready to jump up if trouble came, but her exhaustion was a heavy weight. For the first time since she ran from her father's house, she slept like the dead, with no nightmares to haunt her. The next morning, August had her up before the sun. Time to look like you belong on a ranch, he said. We have got work to do, Margaret. Found out fast that ranch life was hard, endless work. August had her mucking out stalls, stringing up new fence, hauling buckets of water, and a dozen other jobs that made her muscles scream and her hands blister right through her gloves. But she never once complained. She was thankful for the work, for how it wore out her body and kept her mind busy. And she was thankful for August's patient way of teaching, how he showed her how to do things without ever making her feel like a fool for not knowing. They worked alongside each other all day, not talking much, but falling into a comfortable rhythm. August was a natural teacher, and Margaret was surprised to find she liked learning these real-world skills. She was raised to run a house, to boss around servants and plan dinner parties and do needlepoint. This was different. This was real, honest work that you could see and touch at the end of the day. Later that afternoon, a neighbor rode over, an older fella named Jim Powell who owned the ranch to the east. Margaret's heart started hammering against her ribs as August walked out to greet him, but she kept her head down and kept on working, just like August told her to. "Looks like you hired some help," Powell called out. "That is my cousin from Colorado," August answered back. "Easy as you please. Name is Matthew Curtis. He is not one for conversation, but he is a hard worker." Powell gave a wave in Margaret's direction, and she lifted a hand for just a second without looking up, then went right back to hammering a fence post. She did not let out her breath until Powell and August had finished their talk, and the neighbor was riding away. "You did real good," August said when he walked back over. He did not suspect a thing. 3 days went on just like that, falling into a pattern of hard work and constant watchfulness. Margaret found her body getting used to the labor, growing stronger as her hands grew, tough and calloused. She and August settled into an easy kind of friendship, sharing their meals and quiet conversations. He told her stories about his years drifting between ranches, the strange people he had met, and the wild country he had seen. She told him about her childhood, about how kind her mother was, and the books she loved to get lost in. "I always dreamed of traveling," Margaret admitted one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars come out. "I wanted to see San Francisco, maybe even get on a ship to Europe. My mother used to tell me stories about Paris and London. Now I guess I will never see any of it." "Why not?" August asked. "You are young. You have got your whole life stretched out in front of you." "I am on the run from my own father," Margaret said, the bitterness sharp in her voice. "I do not have a penny to my name, no prospects, no future except hiding out or running forever." August was quiet for a long time. He said slowly, "There might be another way." "What way?" He turned to look at her, and in the dim twilight his eyes were dead serious. "You could stay here, not as Matthew Curtis, but as who you really are. As my wife." Margaret felt the air catch in her throat. "What?" "Just hear me out," August said, holding up a hand. "I know we hardly know each other, but just think about it from a practical standpoint. If you were married to me, your father could not legally force you into another marriage. You would be protected by the law, and those men hunting for you would not have any claim on you." "A marriage for convenience," Margaret said, her head spinning as she tried to take it all in. "If that is what you want to call it, then yes," August said. "I am not asking for a single thing you are not willing to give. We could have separate rooms, live separate lives if that is what you want. But on paper, to the law, you would be Margaret Garrett, and that would keep you safe." Margaret's mind was racing. It made a crazy kind of sense, but the thought of being trapped in another arranged marriage, even one meant to protect her, made her stomach clench. "I do not know," she said honestly. "I ran away to keep from being forced into a marriage. How is this any different?" "Because I am asking, not demanding," August said gently. "And because you could leave any time you wanted to. I would never make you stay against your will. This would be your decision. But I understand if you need some time to think on it." Before Margaret could even answer, they heard the thunder of several horses coming toward them, and coming fast. August was on his feet in an instant, his hand already resting on his revolver. "Get in the house," he ordered. "The cellar now." Margaret ran, her heart pounding in her throat. She yanked up the floorboards and dropped into the root cellar, pulling them back down over her head, and was swallowed by complete darkness. Above her, she could hear the heavy sound of August's boots walking to the door. "Good evening," she heard August say, his voice clear enough to travel through the floorboards. "Can I help you, gentlemen? We are looking for a Margaret Catherine." It was a new voice this time, deeper and with more authority. "We have reason to believe she might be hiding somewhere in this area." "I told your other friends a few days back," August said. "I have not seen any woman. It is just me and my cousin working this ranch." "Your cousin?" the man said with clear doubt in his voice. "I think I would like to meet this cousin." Margaret clamped a hand over her mouth, trying to choke back the sound of her own panicked breathing. She heard August's boots move across the floor, then the creak of the door opening. "Matthew," August called out. "Get in here." There was a long pause, and Margaret realized with a jolt of pure terror that August was calling for her. He wanted her to come out. She could not figure what in the world he was thinking, but she knew she had to trust him. With trembling hands, she pushed up the floorboards and climbed out, making sure her hat was pulled down low over her face. She walked to the door, keeping her gaze fixed on the ground. "This here is Matthew Curtis, my cousin from Colorado," August said. "Matthew, these fellas are looking for a runaway girl. You seen anyone like that?" Margaret just shook her head, keeping her shoulders slumped and her face blank. She was painfully aware of the men staring at her, of how close they were to seeing the truth. She could smell the sweat and the horses on them, could feel their eyes sizing her up. "He does not talk much," August said. "Took a knife to the throat in a bar fight a few years back. Messed something up. He can talk if he has to, but it pains him, so he mostly keeps to himself." It was a perfect lie, giving her a reason to stay completely silent. Margaret stood there with her hands stuffed in her pockets, trying to look like every ranch hand she had ever seen, just bored and tired and wanting to be done with it all. "Where you from, boy?" one of the men asked her directly. Margaret just pointed somewhere to the north and west, and then gave a little shrug. "He is from Sterling, Colorado," August answered for her. "That is where my mother's sister lives. Matthew here was not getting along with his stepfather, so I told him he could come work for me." The man who seemed to be the leader stepped forward, and Margaret recognized him. It was Wade Morrison, her father's business partner and so-called friend. If any man alive would recognize her, it would be him. She felt a trickle of cold sweat run down her back, even in the cool night air. "Look at me, boy," Morrison commanded. Margaret slowly lifted her head, keeping her face as empty as she could make it. Morrison stared at her for what felt like an eternity, a long, heart-stopping moment. She could see his eyes taking in her dirty work clothes, her smudged face, and the hat pulled down low. She begged herself not to tremble, not to give away a single thing. "He is just a kid," one of the other men said, sounding tired of it. "Come on, Wade, she is not here." Morrison kept staring, and Margaret thought her heart was going to beat right out of her chest. Then finally he took a step back. "Maybe," he said, "but I am not convinced. We will be watching this place, Garrett. If we find out you have been lying to us, things will not go well for you." "I am not lying," August said calmly, "and I do not appreciate being called a liar on my own property. Now, if there is nothing else you need, my cousin and I have work to finish before it gets dark." The men got on their horses, but Morrison turned and looked back at Margaret one last time. "You take care, boy," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her skin crawl. This is a dangerous country for young people. Margaret gave a single nod, then she turned and walked toward the barn with slow, deliberate steps. Every single nerve in her body was screaming at her to run. She did not dare look back, did not let herself show any reaction, until she heard the sound of the horses fading away. August found her in the barn a few minutes later. She was sitting on a bale of hay and shaking so hard her teeth were chattering. "You did perfectly," he said, kneeling down in front of her. "You were absolutely perfect." "He did not recognize you." "He was looking right into my eyes," Margaret whispered. "He knows me, August. He has been to our house 100 times. If he had looked for 1 second longer—" "But he did not," August interrupted gently. Because you are a good actress, and because people usually see what they expect to see. He expected to see my worn-out cousin who works on a ranch, so that is what he saw. Margaret looked up at him, at this man who had just risked his neck for her, and she felt something change deep in her chest. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Now tell me the truth. It cannot all be on account of your mother. A man could get killed for helping me." August settled down next to her on the bale of hay. "Well, to be honest, at first it was about my mother, about doing for you what I wish someone had done for her. But now—" He trailed off like he was wrestling with the words. "Now, it is about you. It is about the woman you are and the grit you showed just by running. You could have laid down, accepted your fate like so many other women do, but you stood up and fought. You chose for yourself, and that is something worth protecting." Margaret felt hot tears tracing paths down her cheeks. "I am just so tired," she confessed. "Tired of running. Tired of being scared. Tired of always looking over my shoulder." "Then quit running," August said, his voice steady. "Stay right here. Marry me, not as some kind of cage, but as a real partnership. We could build something good together, something that is ours, yours, and mine. I'm not asking you to love me, Margaret. I am just asking you to give yourself a shot at a life that is truly yours to pick." Margaret looked deep into his stormy blue eyes and saw nothing but pure honesty looking back. She considered the life he was offering. It was a far cry from the fancy future she used to dream about, with trips and adventures and tours through Europe. But this was freedom. This was a choice. This was a life where she would be a partner, not a piece of property. "All right," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, I will marry you." August broke into a grin, a real, honest-to-goodness smile that changed his whole serious face and made her heart do a little flip. "You will not regret this," he promised. "I give you my word." They were married just 3 days after that, down in Perowin. It was a small affair at the church, with the circuit preacher saying the words. Margaret wore a simple dress that August had bought for her in town, a pale blue thing with a bit of white lace at the neck. She kept her hair tucked up tight under a bonnet, still jumpy about anyone recognizing her. But August had put the word out that his cousin had headed back to Colorado and that his new bride was coming in from Salt Lake City. The handful of folks who came to the wedding did not have any reason to doubt the story. Standing there before the preacher, holding August's rough, calloused hands in her own, Margaret felt a whole mess of things at once. This was not the fairy tale wedding she had imagined as a girl. There was no family, no friends around her, no long white dress or big party. But when she said her vows and looked into August's eyes, she saw a steady calm there that gave her something she had not felt in months. It felt like hope. When the preacher declared them husband and wife, August gave her a gentle kiss on the forehead. It was a decent and respectful gesture that somehow meant a whole lot more than any fiery embrace ever could have. They were partners now, tied together by the law and by their own free will. They rode back to the ranch as Mr. and Mrs. Garrett and August, bless his heart, insisted on carrying her over the threshold no matter how much she protested. He set her down in the kitchen, and for a moment they just stood there, feeling a bit awkward, suddenly aware that they were married strangers sharing a house. "I meant every word I said," August told her. "You can have the bedroom. I am just fine out here on my own. We do not have to. What I mean is, I am not expecting anything." "I know," Margaret said, and his kindness warmed her clear through. "Thank you for that. But August, we are married now. Maybe we could share the bedroom. Not for anything improper, just to sleep in the same room. It feels mighty strange otherwise." August looked surprised for a second, and then a pleased look came over his face. "If that is what you want, I can haul another mattress in there. We can put it right on the floor next to the bed until we get to know each other a little better." They spent that whole evening getting the bedroom rearranged, setting up a second sleeping spot. It felt so normal and everyday, and somehow it was just perfect. That night, lying in the quiet dark with the sound of August's steady breathing close by, Margaret felt safer than she had in years. The days melted into weeks, and Margaret slipped into her new life as Mrs. Garrett. She took care of the house while August worked the ranch, but more often than not, she was right out there with him, learning to ride the fence lines and push cattle. She found out she had a knack with horses, a kind of patience and gentleness that made them trust her. August taught her how to rope and brand, how to read the clouds and the land, and how to handle a rifle and a revolver to keep herself safe. They grew closer, but slow and careful, like a couple of wild critters learning not to spook each other. August would tell her stories while they worked, telling stories of his time as a wandering cowboy, the peculiar towns he'd drifted through and all the characters he'd come across. Margaret spoke of her deep affection for books, and August once surprised her by riding all the way to town, only to return with 3 novels he reckoned she might take a shine to. They took to sitting together in the evenings, with Margaret reading aloud, as August whittled on a piece of wood or fixed some tack, the lamplight casting a warm glow around them. One evening, about 6 weeks after they'd married, Margaret glanced up from her book and saw August just watching her, an expression on his face she couldn't quite place. "What is it?" she asked him. "I was just sitting here thinking," August said slowly, "about how much fuller this house feels with you in it. How much fuller my whole life feels." Margaret closed the book. "I feel the exact same way," she confessed. "I know this all began as a deal, a practical answer to a big problem. But it's grown into something more for me. You've become more than that." August rose from his chair and came to sit next to her on the sofa. "Margaret, there is something I have to tell you. I never expected any of this when I made you that offer of marriage. I figured we would be friends, partners even, but likely nothing beyond that. But I have gone and fallen in love with you completely and with my whole heart. And I know that is not what you agreed to, so I will surely keep it to myself if you'd like. But I just had to let you know." Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. She looked at this man, the one who had rescued her, kept her safe, and shown her nothing but unwavering kindness and respect. And she knew that somewhere down the line she had fallen in love with him too. "August," she whispered, her hand rising to gently touch his face. "I love you too. I think I have for weeks now, but I was just too scared to say it." He kissed her then, not the hurried peck from their wedding day, but a true kiss, filled with passion and softness and the promise of things to come. Margaret kissed him right back, pouring every feeling she had been keeping locked away into it. When they finally broke apart, they were both a little breathless. "I reckon," Margaret said with a shy smile, "that we do not need 2 mattresses anymore." August let out a laugh, a sound of pure joy, and he kissed her again. That was the night they truly became husband and wife, their marriage finally sealed with love and desire, and a feeling that everything was exactly as it should be. Margaret learned that being with a man you loved, a man who loved you right back, was nothing at all like the cold duty she had dreaded with Vincent Halloway. It was beautiful and tender and full of passion, and she drifted off to sleep in August's arms, feeling safe and cherished and whole. The months that came after were the happiest Margaret had ever known. She and August worked the ranch side by side, building up their herd and fixing up the property. They would talk about their dreams for the future, about maybe making the ranch bigger, about having children someday. Margaret helped August with his reading, sitting with him in the evenings while he practiced. And August taught Margaret how to handle a horse like she was born to it, how to work cattle and rope strays. But all that peace was shattered on a cold morning late in the fall, when a group of riders showed up on the ridge overlooking the ranch. Margaret was out hanging laundry when she spotted them, and her blood ran cold as ice. There had to be at least 8 men, and even from that far off she could tell they were armed to the teeth and looking for a fight. "August!" she yelled. drop in the laundry and run in for the barn where he was working. He came out, took one look up at the riders, and his face turned hard as stone. "Get in the house," he ordered. "Load every gun we own. This is fixin' to get ugly." The riders came down into the valley and fanned out, surrounding the house. Margaret recognized her father right away, sitting straight and tall on his big black stallion, his face a cold, hard mask. Next to him were Vincent Halloway, Morrison, Brewster, and a few other armed men. "August Garrett," her father hollered. "I know my daughter's in there. Send her out now, and we will have no trouble." August stepped out onto the porch, his hand hovering right over his revolver. Margaret stood just inside the door, a rifle clutched in her hands, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Margaret is my wife," August called back, his voice steady. "Legally married before God and the law. She is not going anywhere." "That marriage is not worth the paper it is written on," her father snarled. "She was already promised to Mr. Halloway. She had no right to marry without my say-so." "She is 21 years old," August said flatly. "She does not need your permission for anything. The law is on our side, Mr. Catherine. You have got no claim on her." Vincent Halloway spurred his horse forward, his voice slick as oil and just as dangerous. "I paid a good price for that woman. I have a contract with her father. She belongs to me." "A woman is not a horse to be bought and sold," August said, his voice hard as iron. "Now I suggest you men turn your horses around and ride on out of here before somebody gets hurt." "You are outnumbered, Cowboy," Morrison sneered. "It is 8 against 1. You cannot win this fight." "Maybe not," August agreed, his eyes sweeping over them. "But I can guarantee some of you will not be riding away from here today. So you all need to ask yourselves, is she really worth dying for?" A heavy silence fell over the yard. Margaret could see the men fidgeting in their saddles, turning the question over in their minds. She took a deep breath and stepped out onto the porch to stand right beside August, the rifle held steady in her hands. "I am not going with you, Father," she called out, her voice ringing clear and strong. "I would rather die right here than marry Mr. Halloway. August is my husband, and I love him. And that is something that is never going to change." Her father's face went from white to red with pure fury. "You ungrateful girl! After everything I have done for you, everything I have—" You are willing to toss it all aside for a dirt-poor rancher who has absolutely nothing." "He has his honor," Margaret declared. "He has his kindness. He has his love. That is far more than Mr. Halloway could ever give me, no matter how much money he has." Vincent Halloway's face contorted in a mask of pure fury. "You little tramp. You really think I would still want you after you have been spoiled by another man? You are completely worthless to me now." "Good," Margaret replied with an icy calm. "In that case, you have no reason at all to be here. There is still the issue of the bride price I paid for you," Halloway snarled. $5,000. I expect to get it back." "That is an issue between you and her father," August said firmly. "We do not owe you a single thing." The tense standoff dragged on, the air thick with unspoken threats. Margaret watched as fingers twitched just above their holstered pistols. She could see the cold calculations flicker in the men's eyes. She knew August was right. If guns started blazing, people were going to die. She sent up a silent prayer that it would not end that way. Then a new voice cut through the tension from behind them. "Well, now, it looks to me like you fellas are trespassing on private land and making threats against a married woman. That is mighty illegal in the Utah Territory." Every head turned to see Sheriff Ben Tucker approaching with 3 deputies. They were all armed, and they all looked like they meant business. The sheriff was an older fellow with streaks of gray in his beard and sharp eyes that did not miss a thing. He guided his horse to a stop right between August's front porch and the group of riders. "Sheriff," Richard Catherine said, his voice dripping with false courtesy, "this is just a family disagreement. My daughter ran off and married this man here without my blessing. She is of legal age to marry," the sheriff stated plainly, "and I have already seen the marriage license myself. It is all official and above board. She has every right to marry whoever she pleases." He then shot a look of clear contempt at Vincent Halloway. As for you, sir, there is no such thing as a legal bride price in this territory. Any money you handed over to this girl's father was a gift, plain and simple, not a binding contract. You have absolutely no claim on Mrs. Garrett. This is an outrage, Holloway sputtered. What is outrageous, the sheriff said in a cold tone, is 8 armed men showing up at a private ranch and threatening folks. So right now, I'm going to give you boys a choice. You can either turn your horses around and ride on back to New Mexico territory with no trouble, or I can place every last one of you under arrest for trespassing, making threats, and disturbing the peace. So, what is it going to be? Margaret saw her father's jaw tighten and recognized the rage burning in his eyes. But he was not a foolish man. He knew when he was outmatched. "This is not finished," he said, staring at Margaret with a look that was close to pure hatred. "You are no longer a daughter of mine. Do not you ever set foot in my house again." "I would not dream of it," Margaret replied, and she was surprised at how little his words stung. This man who valued a business deal more than his own child's happiness was no real loss to her at all. The men wheeled their horses around and rode off, the menace they brought with them fading into the distance. The sheriff waited until they were completely out of sight before he spoke to August and Margaret. "That was a close call," he said. "I am mighty glad Jim Powell rode into town and let me know there might be trouble brewing out here. He saw that group gathering and figured you all could use a hand. Please thank him for us," August said, the relief clear in his voice. "And we thank you, Sheriff. I am not sure how that would have turned out if you had not shown up." "I have a hunch you would have handled it just fine," the sheriff replied, looking at August with a newfound respect. "But I am still glad I could help. You two take care of yourselves. And Mrs. Garrett, welcome to Parowan. I truly hope you find happiness here." After the sheriff rode off, Margaret and August just stood there on the porch, watching the sun start its slow journey down behind the western mountains. Margaret leaned her head against August, feeling his strong arm wrap around her shoulders. "It is truly over," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "They are gone. My father has cut me off. I am finally free." "You were always free," August said gently, "from the very moment you decided to run. But yes, I suppose now it is official. You are Margaret Garrett, my wife, and nobody is ever going to take you from me." Margaret turned to look up at him, seeing the deep love in his eyes, the strength and the simple goodness that had first drawn her to him. "I love you," she said. "I know I tell you that all the time, but I need you to understand just how much you have given me. You gave me my life back. You gave me a future. You showed me what love was when I thought I would never find it." "You gave me the very same thing," August said, as he gently cupped her face in his hands. "Before you came along, I was just going through the motions, just existing day to day. You made me feel truly alive again. You turned this house into a home. You are my everything, Margaret." They shared a kiss as the sun finally set, splashing the sky with fiery colors. And Margaret reflected on how strange and wonderful life could be. She had fled from one kind of future and stumbled right into a much better one. She had found real love in the last place she ever expected, with a simple cowboy who was brave enough to hide her, and then stand up to the men who were chasing her. That first winter was a hard one, with heavy snows that kept them mostly indoors for weeks on end. But Margaret did not mind one bit. She and August spent the long evenings sitting by the fire, just talking and reading and staying warm together under piles of thick quilts. They made their plans for the spring, talking about growing their herd and planting a garden, and all the little ordinary things that go into building a life together. Then, in February, Margaret realized she was pregnant. She told August one morning as they ate breakfast, and she watched his face change from pure surprise to absolute joy, and then to something that looked like awe. "A baby," he whispered, reaching across the small table to take her hand. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy about it?" Margaret asked, feeling a sudden wave of nerves. "Happy?" August got up from his chair, walked around the table, and pulled her up into a big hug. "Margaret, I am more than happy. I am completely overwhelmed. I am terrified. I am happier than I ever knew a person could be. You are giving me a family, a real family." Margaret held on to him tightly, feeling happy tears slide down her cheeks. "We are going to be wonderful parents," she said. "We will love this child and keep them safe and always let them choose their own way in life." "Always," August promised her. Their baby was born in late September of 1879, a strong, healthy boy with dark hair and his father's blue-gray eyes. They named him Thomas, after August's own father, who had passed away when he was just a boy. Margaret had never known a love like the one she felt for this tiny person, this perfect blend of herself and August. She would just hold him and stare in wonder at his little fingers, his rosebud mouth, and the way he would look up at her with so much trust and need in his eyes. August was a wonderful father, helping with the baby any chance he got. He would walk the floor with Thomas at night when he cried, and he would make funny faces just to see his son's first smiles. Margaret would watch the two of them together and feel her heart nearly burst with love for them both. The years went by in a happy haze of hard work, simple joys, and the usual ups and downs of life on a ranch. They had good years, and they had tough years. Times when cattle prices were high, and times when they had to scrape by just to make ends meet. But they always faced it all side by side, true partners in every part of their life. 2 years after Thomas came along, Margaret gave birth to a daughter they named Elena after August's mother. She was a beautiful little girl with her mother's dark eyes and a stubborn streak that made both her parents chuckle. 3 years after that, another son, James, was born. He was a quiet, thoughtful boy who loved nothing more than to trail after his father all around the ranch. As the children got bigger, the ranch got bigger right along with them. August and Margaret worked from sunup to sundown building up their herd, improving the barns and fences, and hiring extra hands during the busy roundup and branding seasons. They earned the respect of everyone in the Parowan community, becoming known for their honesty and their tireless work ethic, and for the powerful love everyone could see they shared for each other and for their children. Margaret never got another word from her father. She heard through letters from old friends now and then that he had lost a good portion of his fortune on some bad investments, that Vincent Halloway had sued him to get the bride price back and won, and that he had turned into a bitter and lonely old man. She felt a touch of sadness for him, but she had no regrets. She knew she had chosen the right life, even if he would never be able to understand it. On their 10th anniversary, August took Margaret on a trip to Salt Lake City. It was the first time they had ever left the ranch together since the day they were married. They checked into a fine hotel, ate in fancy restaurants, browsed the shops, and Margaret bought a stack of books she had always dreamed of reading. But the very best part was just having time alone with August, remembering all the reasons they had first fallen in love, and renewing the promise they had made to each other all those years ago. "Do you ever regret any of it?" August asked her one night as they lay in the big hotel bed. "Giving up the kind of life you could have had, the traveling, the excitement, all those things you wanted when you were a girl?" Margaret gave it an honest thought before she answered. "I would be lying if I said I never wondered what it might have been like to see Paris or to sail across an ocean. But no, I do not regret it, because everything I ever truly wanted in my heart, I found with you. Love, a partnership, a family, a life that I get to build myself. That is worth more than any grand adventure could ever be." "I love you," August said, pulling her in close. "I will love you until I take my very last breath, and even after that." "And I love you," Margaret whispered back. "My cowboy, my hero, my home." They went back to the ranch feeling rested and happy, back to their children who had missed them terribly, and back to a life that had carried on just fine without them. Life kept moving forward. The seasons changed, the children grew, and their love for each other only deepened. When Thomas turned 16, he was a young man who looked so much like his father it sometimes made Margaret's heart ache. He started asking questions about her family, about why he had never once met his own grandfather. Margaret and August agreed that it was finally time to tell their children the entire story of how they met. They told them all about the forced marriage and the desperate escape, and about the kind cowboy who had been brave enough to risk his own life for a total stranger. The children listened with complete attention. Thomas and Elena and James gathered around the big kitchen table as their parents shared the tale of how their family began. When they had finished, Elena had tears welling in her eyes. "That's the most romantic thing I've ever heard," she said. "Papa saved you." "We saved each other," Margaret corrected in a soft voice. "I gave your father a reason to find his courage, and he gave me a shot at being free. That is the thing about love. It makes you a better person than you ever thought you could be." "I hope I can love like that one day," Helena said, her voice full of dreams. "You will," August promised her. "But it will be your choice. No one is ever going to push you into a marriage you do not want. I give you my word on that." Thomas looked at his father with a newfound admiration. "You stood up to 8 armed men for Mother. I would have stood up to 100, August said plainly. "When you love somebody, truly love them, you do not waste time thinking about the danger. All you can think about is keeping them safe." Margaret reached her hand across the table and took August's, and their children saw the look that passed between them, a deep and lasting love that had carried them through more than 15 years side by side. More years rolled on by. The children grew up and began building their own lives. Thomas started taking on more of the ranch duties, soaking up every piece of knowledge his father could pass down about running the place. Elena fell for a schoolteacher from Cedar City, a good-hearted man who adored her fiery nature and sharp intellect. James headed off to university in Salt Lake City, becoming the first in the family to chase a higher education, cheered on every step of the way by parents who wanted him to have every chance in the world. Silver began to show at August's temples, and Margaret noticed new lines crinkling around her eyes. But their love remained, still partners in everything, still the best of friends. You could find them on the porch most evenings, watching the sun dip behind the same mountains they had gazed at for so many years, feeling nothing but thankful for the life they had made together. For their 25th anniversary, the children decided to throw them a big party. The whole ranch buzzed with friends and neighbors, filled with music and laughter and plates piled high with food. As Margaret danced with August underneath the stars, her mind drifted back to the girl she used to be, scared to death and all out of options, riding through the desert without a plan or a speck of hope. She thought about the cowboy who had given her a place to hide and stared down the men chasing her, the man who had offered her safety and freedom, and finally, his whole heart. "What are you thinking about?" August asked, pulling her in close as they moved with the music. "About how blessed I am," Margaret said. "About how a single choice, just one moment of bravery, can set your whole life on a different path. If I had not run away, if you had not decided to help me, where would we be?" "Apart," August said with a serious tone. "And I can't even picture a life like that. You are such a part of me now, I can hardly recall what my life was like before you came into it." "I love you, August Garrett," Margaret said, gazing up into his eyes, those stormy gray eyes that were the very first thing she had ever truly seen in him. "I have loved you for 25 years, and I will love you for whatever time the good Lord grants us." "And I love you, Margaret," August answered. "My runaway bride, my partner, my everything." They shared a kiss right there in the flickering light, with the family and community they had built all around them. And Margaret knew that if she could somehow go back and tell that frightened girl in the desert what the future had in store, she would not have believed a word of it. She would never believe that fleeing from one wedding would lead her right into the arms of her true love, or that a desperate flight for her life would turn into the grandest adventure she could ever imagine. The years kept on their steady march. August and Margaret grew old with each other, their love deepening and softening like a fine wine. They became grandparents, delighting in watching their own children raise families. They saw the ranch they had poured their souls into get passed down to Thomas, who managed it with the same love and hard work they always had. When August was in his late 60s, he came down with a bad fever that had Margaret worried sick. She tended to him constantly, sitting by his bed day and night, recalling how he had done the same for her when she'd had a terrible bout of influenza years earlier. When he finally pulled through, a little weaker but alive, they just held each other and cried with relief. "I am not ready to let you go," Margaret had whispered into his shoulder. "You will not be losing me for a long while yet," August promised. "We have plenty of years left. I plan on seeing all our grandchildren grow up. I want to dance at their weddings. I want to grow old and gray and sit right here on this porch with you when we are too weary to do much else." And that is exactly what they did. They saw their grandchildren get married and their great-grandchildren come into the world. They watched the century turn, ushering in new inventions and changes they could never have dreamed of as young folks. They even saw automobiles begin to replace horses in town, though they mostly stuck to the old ways out on the ranch. On a warm summer evening in 1921, when Margaret was 64 and August was 68, they sat on their porch just as they had 1,000 times before. The sun was setting in a brilliant spectacle of orange and crimson, painting the mountains in fiery hues. August held Margaret's hand, his grip still firm, even after all his years. "Do you remember the very first time we sat out here together?" August asked. "The night after your father's men came searching for you." "I remember," Margaret said, her voice soft. "I was so terribly frightened. I thought I would never feel safe again." "And now I understand what it is to be truly safe," Margaret said. "Not because there is no trouble left in the world, but because I have you here with me. Because we put this life together, this home, this family. I am safe because I am loved." August lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "You gave me everything, Margaret. Everything I never even knew I wanted or needed. You made me into the man I am today." "And you saved me," Margaret said, "not just from that marriage, but from a life where I had no say, no choice, no control over my own path. You gave me freedom, August. You let me be myself." They sat there in a comfortable quiet, watching the stars pop out one by one, holding hands just as they had for more than 4 decades. The ranch stretched out before them, thriving and cared for, a living proof of their hard work and partnership. Lights began to glow in the windows of the houses their children had built on the property, family close by, but with their own space just the way August and Margaret had always wanted. "I would do it all over again," August said out of the blue. "Every single moment, every fight, every lean year, and every good one, I would pick you again and again in any lifetime." "And so would I," Margaret said, tears making shiny tracks down her wrinkled cheeks. "You are my one great love, August Garrett, the love of my entire life. Every good thing in my world started the moment I rode into your valley asking for a little help. And I looked up and saw the woman who was going to change it all," August said. "The woman who would make me believe in love again, in hope, and in the chance for a happy life." They kissed then, a soft, gentle kiss that held 43 years of love and teamwork and devotion. All around them, the ranch settled down for the night. Children were being called to bed, animals were rustling in their stalls, and the wind was whispering through the cottonwood trees that August had planted during their very first year of marriage. Margaret and August Garrett would sit on that porch for many more years to come, watching their family grow and prosper, feeling certain that they had built something real and lasting. They had started out with nothing more than courage, desperation, and a simple act of kindness. And from that, they had created a legacy of love that would carry on for generations. And on quiet nights, when the stars shone bright and the air was crisp, they would tell each other their story, just one more time. The story of the woman running from a marriage she never chose, and the cowboy who hid her and stood up to her pursuers, and how that single act of bravery led to the greatest love story either of them could have ever dreamed up. It was their story, their truth, their forever. And they never grew tired of remembering how it all started, in dust and desperation, and the first quiet stirrings of a love that was big enough to last a lifetime and then some. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.